Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Danny Ackright and I am one of the organizers of History Camp Iowa. We have the other organizers on the call with us tonight. We've got Megan Bendixson, Hope Bibbins, and Leo Landis. You may interact with them at any of the events this week and definitely this Saturday. So thanks to them for helping make this happen. We are thrilled that you are able to join us virtually tonight to hear from our friends at the Museum of Danish America. Before I pass it over to Dia, I'd like to tell you a little bit about History Camp Iowa. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to providing opportunities for Iowans to engage with history, both local and otherwise. Our main event is an annual unconference, this Saturday's event, which is like a normal conference, but everyone is welcome to attend and anyone can present. History Camp Iowa is one of several history camps, with others in Boston, Colorado, Philadelphia, Pioneer Valley, and Virginia, some of whose fans are joining us tonight from their home states. If you don't already, I would encourage you to like us on Facebook and visit historycamp.org to learn about all of the History Camp locations, including History Camp Iowa. Finally, I'd like to thank Drake University for graciously hosting tonight's Zoom. Now, a couple points of housekeeping before we begin. Please be sure to keep your microphone on mute during the presentation. You can change the viewing settings of the presentation at the top right of your screen. And if your volume is low, please note that you control that through your computer's volume. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Dia Nagaraj. Dia is the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Museum of Danish America in Elkhorn, Iowa. A Pittsburgh native, she studied environmental policy and art history at Washington University in St. Louis. After serving in AmeriCorps for a year, she then completed a master's in technical art history at the University of Glasgow in Scotland before joining the Museum of Danish America last summer. Her main research focus since joining the staff has been Danish porcelain, culminating in the traveling exhibit, Art Nouveau Innovation, Danish Porcelain from an American Collector. Dia, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody, and welcome to a virtual tour of the Museum of Danish America. As Danny said, my name is Dia Nagaraj, and I am the Associate Curator of Exhibitions here at the museum. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about the history of the museum, our grounds, and how we care for our collection, along with a little background on Danish American history. And then I'll talk in more detail about my area of work, which is our exhibitions program. At the Museum of Danish America, our mission is to explore the Danish American experience, the historic and modern influences of Denmark on the United States, and the continuing story of how a nation of immigrants shape American identity. The idea for the museum first emerged in 1979 at Dana College in Blair, Nebraska, and a committee was formed by the Danish American Heritage Society to look into the project further. The Danish villages of Elkhorn and Kimballton were chosen as the location in 1983. Our first official building was not actually the main museum building, but rather a house known as Beestamour's House, a historic house museum and National Register of Historic Places property, which was deeded to the museum in 1990. Beestamour's House means grandmother's house in Danish, and it was built in 1908 by Jens Otto Christensen, a Danish immigrant and Elkhorn resident. Supposedly, it was intended as an engagement gift for a local woman, but she sadly refused his proposal. As a result, he likely never lived in the house himself, but rather rented it out, often to Danish and Danish American families looking to begin their lives in Elkhorn. Much of the house is original, including the foundation, siding, and many of the decorative elements that you can see in the exterior construction. In 1982, the last resident of the house, Mette Mortensen, sold the house to the Elkhorn-Kimballton Arts and Recreation Council. They spent a year restoring the house to reflect turn-of-the-century decor and styles, and eventually deeded it to the museum in 1990. We now operate it as a historic house museum, open partly through the year. Our main museum building opened in 1994 and is now the nation's only museum dedicated to preserving and promoting Danish culture in America. We were originally known as the Danish Immigrant Museum, but in 2013, we changed our name to the Museum of Danish America to be more inclusive of all generations of Danish Americans. In 2017, the Museum of Danish America was awarded accreditation by the American Alliance of Museums. Less than 3% of museums in the country are awarded that distinction, so it's something that we're really proud of. Accreditation means that we have displayed to the AAM, a national body, and to our peers around the world that we meet the highest professional standards in all that we do. In addition to the museum, we also have a genealogy center, which is a research library with significant family history resources. If you or anybody you know are trying to track down a Danish ancestor and learn more about their story, the Genealogy Center staff are always happy to speak to you further about potential research projects. Before I discuss our collection and the stories that we tell inside our museum, I'd like to share some of the work that we do outside our museum's walls. Here at the Museum of Danish America, we have the Jens Jensen Prairie Landscape Park, which is over 30 acres of recreated Iowa prairie, recreating the type of landscape that European settlers would have encountered when they first arrived in the area. Of course, Native people were living on and changing the landscape for centuries prior to that, but with the advent of industrial farming methods, there is almost no original Iowa prairie left in the state. So areas like these are really important for many different plant and animal species. Jens Jensen, the person for whom this space is named, was a Danish immigrant and landscape architect who worked with figures like Frank Lloyd Wright and was instrumental in the design of many of Chicago's parks. He was a pioneer in the Prairie School of Landscape Architecture and advocated for native species and the conservation of natural areas, which is what we're working towards with the land here. In the prairie, we feature different elements of both Jens Jensen's design philosophy in the form of council rings, as well as broader Danish design, like the Danish designed fitness equipment that we have set up outside. This outdoor gym is in keeping with Jens Jensen's ideas that you should do things outdoors that you would more often do inside. On the northwest corner of the prairie, we also have a small wetland habitat. Unfortunately, it was hit badly by heavy rains a few years back, but we are currently embarking on a restoration project to turn it into a space that can support a variety of wildlife, from waterfowl to semi-aquatic mammals like muskrat, and a number of amphibians. One of the species that we've seen most often in the area is the American toad, and this year our prairie intern Kiara actually documented its full life cycle in the wetlands, from eggs to tadpoles and all the way up to mature adults. I'll be honest, I tried helping her catch frogs and toads many a time, and I'm not sure I was a lot of help in documenting the species, but it was a lot of fun. Apart from the toads and frogs, we have a number of other really fascinating species found in our prairie, so I'd like to just share a few of them with you. Butterflies are our most visible species, especially during the summer months. And there are days when, as you walk through the prairie, you'll be surrounded by hundreds of them. But we do have a number of other really interesting invertebrate species, along with some larger vertebrates as well. I'll give you a break from my voice for a minute and just let you enjoy the wildlife and reminisce about warmer weather. So that's a small peek at some of the species that we have documented in the prairie. Each year, our prairie intern works on increasing that list of documented species, so it's always interesting and exciting to hear about new animals and plants that were found out there. Another interesting feature on the exterior of the building that I'd like to talk about before we journey inside is our green roof. Below it is the curatorial center where many staff offices and collection vaults are located. The green roof was planted with native grasses and other species to maximize energy efficiency and increase the thermal barrier between the outdoor environment and artifact storage areas. This helps to ensure that artifacts stay at a nice, consistent temperature, no matter the extremes of Iowa weather, like, say, we experienced over the past week. So now that we've talked about the history of the museum and our grounds, I'd like to take you inside the museum. To start, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on Danish immigration and settlement. On the lower level of the museum, we have a timeline that covers about 14,000 years of history and 90 feet, all the way from prehistory to the current day. Of course, a complete discussion of Danish immigration would take a few hours, if not a full day. But since we don't have that kind of time, I'll try and cover the most important bits. Danish immigrants have been present in the country for hundreds of years. In fact, one of George Washington's generals in the Revolutionary War was Danish. In the mid-1800s, the Danish population grew pretty quickly and the job market could not keep up, so unemployment rose sharply. Children growing up in rural areas could no longer plan on owning a farm when they grew up, as the oldest son would inherit the family farm. Therefore, many of the earliest Danish immigrants were single young men hoping that they'd be able to get a farm, marry, and start a family. Between 1820 and 1850, only about 60 Danes per year were arriving in the United States. The first major wave of Danish immigration were Mormon converts in the 1850s who arrived in the US and often made the long trek to Utah. About 17,000 Danish Mormons in total arrived in America. Another wave of immigration occurred after the 1864 Second Schleswig War, when most of Schleswig-Holstein became German. Under Prussian rule, German military service was required and Danish culture was repressed, so many Schleswig Danes chose to flee. Stories from early immigrants made their way back to Denmark and were published in things like newspapers and attracted even more immigrants. After the American Civil War, we see the numbers of Danish immigrants rise significantly. Between 1850 and 1920, around 300,000 Danes immigrated to the United States for economic opportunity, to avoid persecution, or simply for adventure. Of course, Danish immigration did not end in 1920, and at the museum, we explore more recent immigration stories as well. In the early 1800s, most Danes chose to settle in the East. However, as time went on, more and more chose to settle further west. The 1862 Homestead Act opened up land that had been taken from indigenous people to white settlement, and many Danes took advantage of the law. Popular destinations for many Danish immigrants in the late 1800s and early 1900s were Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. By 1920, California had the largest population of Danish immigrants, a statistic that remains true to today. Although most Danes assimilated fairly easily, a process certainly made smoother by the fact that they were white, Northern European, and mostly Protestant, Danish fraternal organizations and other community-based groups continued to provide support to the Danish American community and keep cultural traditions alive. To tell the story of Danish immigration, Danish Americans, and ongoing Danish contributions to America, we have over 20,000 artifacts in our curatorial collection that ranges from archaeological materials to family heirlooms to paintings and sculptures to tools and even a car. Obviously, not all of our objects can be on display at any given time, so we have 3 behind-the-scenes vaults as well as a visual storage area. I'll take you through some of these collections areas, highlighting the ways in which we take care of the artifacts in our care. This is our main vault where many of our larger objects are stored. Most of our trunk collection is located here in the main vault. I'll let everybody take a quick second and think of what you'd put in a trunk if you had to pack up your entire life and move to another country. Would you bring clothes? Would you bring books? Would you bring family heirlooms? Technology? Trying to figure out what was necessary for their new lives was an important part of the planning process for somebody immigrating to the US, especially in the 19th century. Everything that they needed for their new life had to fit into this trunk, including clothing, cooking implements, work tools, and only then, if they had room, could they include keepsakes and heirlooms to allow them to remember the country and often family that they were leaving behind. The entire museum, but particularly the collection storage areas, have strict standards for temperature, light, and relative humidity that ensures that objects of different materials are stable. We also ensure that any material that makes contact with our objects will not cause any damage, such as putting foam between an artifact and a varnished surface, as you can see with the foam placed underneath each of our trunks. This is our South Vault, where the textile collection is kept. Our textile collection ranges from American and Danish flags to wedding dresses and quilts to a muskrat hat with the head still attached. Each of the boxes are numbered to help staff locate objects, and we also have labels to tell us whether or not the inventory process has been completed. Inventory is an ongoing process where collection staff and interns go through each object in the collection, update the condition reports, check documentation, and if necessary, suggest objects for deaccessioning. Deaccessioning is when we remove an object from our collection, and it's something that is never taken lightly. The primary reasons for deaccessioning an object would be because we lack documentation or provenance and the object cannot tell its own story. There are already many of that type of artifact in the collection, or the condition is very, very poor and it cannot be conserved. We use tissue in our textile collection boxes to help protect the artifacts. There are two types, buffered and unbuffered. Which one we use depends on the type of material present in the artifact. I won't get into the full chemistry of it, but a quick summary is that buffered tissue contains an alkaline reserve to help neutralize acidity that might form in and migrate out of objects made out of plant-based or cellulose materials like cotton, whereas unbuffered tissue is for animal-based materials like wool or silk and has a neutral pH. When in doubt, we use unbuffered just to be safe. Every few years, the tissue has to be changed as it becomes less effective at protecting objects over time, and we mark the date of this change on the boxes so that we know when it next must be replaced. Currently, I am working on research for an upcoming exhibit on weddings, and so I'd like to share an interesting object from that work. This is a wedding dress worn by Fern Nelson when she married Leonard Richardson in 1932 in Humboldt, Iowa. Her mother and older sister made it, and you can see the effort that they put in, particularly with the beautiful lace collar. Nowadays, of course, we associate weddings with white dresses, and wearing black dresses to weddings sometimes has negative connotations. However, for many immigrants, they viewed their wedding dress simply as their best dress, because the idea of a dress that you only wore once was simply not a possibility for a family that did not have much disposable income. Therefore, we see many dresses that were not white being made for and worn at weddings because it allowed the bride to then use it for later formal occasions as well. This is visual storage, where we keep about 8,000 of our artifacts. As you can see, the walls are glass, so this area is completely visible to the public whenever you come down to the lower level of the museum. Since we can only display a small fraction of our collection at any given time, visual storage is a great way to make our collection more accessible and to be able to share even more Danish American stories with people. In addition to visual storage, our collection is also fully searchable on our website, danishmuseum.org, under the View Our Collection heading. The items that we have in visual storage range from porcelain to shoes to metals to work tools and even some ship models. One piece in visual storage that I find particularly engaging is this automobile prototype called the Blonde Comet, built by Lawrence P. Madsen. Madsen would eventually become the first automobile manufacturer west of Chicago when he began manufacturing Buicks in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1906. Even before that, however, he was trying to build a horseless carriage, and this was one of his attempts, which he made out of a sewing machine, 2 wash boilers, a baby carriage, and other odds and ends that he could find. Supposedly, its top speed was 18 miles per hour, and I'll let you be the judge of whether or not you'd want to ride in it. I'd like to now share 2 of our exhibitions with you, one that is currently on display at the museum, as well as our newest traveling exhibit, which just opened at Iowa State University Museums in Ames. At the museum, we have 3 rotating exhibit gallery spaces. Our largest is the Cramey Gallery on the upper level, and then we have our main floor gallery, which is often used for art shows, and we also have a multimedia room that features a screen for films and other media. Our current main floor gallery features these beautiful, brightly colored pieces of art by Danish artist Susanne Thea in a series entitled Snapshots, Traveling with the Poet Hans Christian Andersen. Many of you may have heard the famous Hans Christian Andersen quote, "To travel is to live." And throughout his life, he did just that, traveling throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. This series was based upon his travelogue, A Poet's Bazaar, which he wrote about his travels in the early 1840s. At that time, he took the most advanced forms of travel available, including steamboats and trains. Susanne Thea, however, chose an even more modern form of technology to visit the places that Andersen wrote about, Google. These are all hand-colored copper etchings, and many of the pieces have a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale associated with them. The square works are 20 by 20 centimeters, deliberately chosen by the artist to be about the same size as a face. As you may notice, many of the scenes take place within a much larger female figure. As you may or may not know, Hans Christian Andersen was a papierclip or paper cutting artist. And so Susanne Thea was inspired by his paper cuts of women and used that form for the background of many of her works. I'd like to dedicate the rest of my presentation to Art Nouveau Innovation, Danish Porcelain from an American Collector, our latest traveling exhibit, which, as I mentioned, recently opened up at Iowa State University Museums. The collector, Dr. Todd Reiser, has focused on Danish porcelain and was generous enough to share his collection and his expertise with us to make this project a reality. This was my first major project after joining the museum, and coming into it, I didn't have much familiarity with ceramics, especially not Danish porcelain. But after doing the research for it and learning more about it, it's become a major subject of interest. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about it more with everyone today. So some of you may already have some familiarity with Danish porcelain. You may have heard of the 2 major companies, Royal Copenhagen and Bang & Grundahl, or you may have seen the very popular Christmas plates that are collectibles. They're sold in antique stores throughout the state and on display in the houses of many a family. In general, the companies are both known best for their blue and white pieces, in particular those Christmas plates. However, the Art Nouveau period was a time of significant stylistic and technical innovation, and we see both companies producing pieces that were in demand around the world. So I'm going to take a break from talking for a minute and just let you enjoy a few pictures of the pieces to get a sense of Art Nouveau Danish porcelain and what it means. Now that you have a little bit of a sense of the diversity of pieces encapsulated by the phrase Art Nouveau Danish porcelain, I'd like to give you a little bit of history on the 2 companies before I get into the Art Nouveau period. By the mid-1700s, several Danish companies had started making faience, which is a relative of porcelain made using different materials and fired at a lower temperature. King Frederick V wanted to begin manufacturing porcelain in Denmark, so he brought in Louis Fournier from France in 1760. That first experiment was not successful, and Fournier's porcelain factory didn't last very long, but not everybody was disillusioned. Within the next decade, the Royal Copenhagen Porcelain Manufactory would be founded, later followed by the establishment of their major domestic rival, Bang & Grundahl. Royal Copenhagen was founded in 1775 by Franz Heinrich Müller and got the name Royal Copenhagen because the Danish crown took control of the company in 1779. This royal monopoly was key to getting the factory off the ground, and by 1780, they began selling large quantities of underglaze painted blue and white dinnerware, along with more ornate overglaze decorated pieces. After Muller retired in 1802, the factory's work unfortunately declined in quality and quantity, and it wouldn't be until the 1880s that the factory once again took a leading role in European porcelain. The company shifted to private hands in 1868 with Philip Schue of Aluminia, a faience factory, becoming the owner in 1882. Bang & Grundahl was established in 1853. Frederick Wilhelm Grundahl was a former Royal Copenhagen employee who left because of artistic disagreements with leadership. Combining his technical knowledge with the resources of the businessmen M.H. and J.H. Bing, they formed the Bang & Grundahl porcelain factory. Unfortunately, Grundahl died shortly after the company was set up, and the Bing brothers had to bring in craftsmen from outside the country just to keep the company afloat. As far as the companies today, in 1987, Royal Copenhagen acquired Bang & Grundahl, and their production now occurs almost entirely in Thailand to save costs. So basically, coming into the 1880s, we have two companies who are struggling a little bit and really in need of fresh perspectives. Arnold Krogh was hired as the artistic director of Royal Copenhagen in 1885, and we can credit him with bringing about the advent of Art Nouveau Danish porcelain. He felt that porcelain's intrinsic beauty should be celebrated and moved the company towards the now famous Danish naturalistic style of underglaze painting. The plate that you see on screen is attributed to Krogh and is an early example of underglaze from this period. At the beginning of this period, they were still working on refining the technique, so we see a lot of blurring of the lines that occurred during the firing process. Sometimes gilding was added to help create the illusion of sharper lines, which is what we see in the vase. I just want to back up for a second and quickly explain the difference between underglaze and overglaze. In underglaze painting, the unglazed porcelain is painted before being dipped into a clear glaze and then fired. With overglaze, the piece must be fired once after glazing and then again at a lower temperature after it is painted. For a long time, all underglaze painting was done in blue because cobalt could handle the firing temperatures well. However, at Royal Copenhagen during this period, their chemist, Adolphe Clement, set about developing other colors that could also withstand the firing temperatures. In addition to their work on new underglaze colors, Clement and his successor Valdemar Engelhardt also developed new glazes that led to a highly successful new line of porcelain. These included snakeskin and crystalline glazes in a variety of colors. In order to accommodate these glazes, new porcelain forms were developed that helped to accentuate the glaze effects. This polar bear was one of my favorite pieces in the show because it really captures the technical innovations that were happening at the time. It features underglaze painting as well as two of those aforementioned glazes, a green crystalline glaze to create the effect of icy water, and then a white snakeskin glaze to create the snowy effect that you see on the edge of the pool. Unlike some of the other forms where The glaze could simply be allowed to flow naturally and create its own effects. The glazes on this piece had to be very carefully placed to create the naturalistic effects that you can see in the final product. As Royal Copenhagen's underglaze pieces grew in popularity, Bing and Grundahl looked for a new artistic direction to take them beyond utilitarian wear. Their earliest underglaze attempt, the 1888 Heron Service, featuring blue underglaze painting and gilding, became an international sensation. However, the factory only mastered the underglaze technique fully in 1895 when Frans August Hallen, a former underglaze signature artist at Royal Copenhagen, joined the company. At international exhibitions, Bing and Grundahl were sometimes criticized for their lack of originality and for simply following in the footsteps of Royal Copenhagen. After such criticism during the Stockholm Exposition of 1897, J.F. Williamson was hired to create a new artistic identity over the next 3 years. The focus there then shifted to the production of elaborate and extremely costly carved vases with openwork for the 1900 Paris World's Fair, allowing them to surpass their domestic rival. You can see 3 examples of the kinds of intricate work that they were producing on screen. The middle vase is particularly impressive as it is actually double layered. So if you look closely, you can see the blue internal vase peeking through the open work of the tulips on the exterior. Women took a leading role at Bing and Grundahl, with Fanny Gard and Effie Hagerman Lindencrone being responsible for many of the pieces that brought the company such fame and acclaim. Women played an important role at Royal Copenhagen as well, but predominantly in the department that was responsible for mass market pieces that we'll discuss in a bit, and thus their names are often lost to history. Artists during the Art Nouveau period often drew inspiration from the natural world. The factories of both companies were only a short walk from the Copenhagen Zoo, so artists and modelers had easy access to a wide range of wildlife. In some cases, modelers kept animals in their studios or on the grounds for study, as you see here with Carl Lisberg and his ducks. In addition, casts were made directly from some plant and animal specimens when possible. In 1888, Royal Copenhagen introduced their first underglaze figurines, beginning with 2 codfish and an eel by Carl Lisberg, likely cast from specimens. This codfish on screen is a prototype of that 1888 figure. Inspiration came from both animals found in and around Denmark, like this lumpsucker, the roe of which was considered a delicacy, and those found thousands of miles away, like this box with a monkey. Another major influence on Art Nouveau styles and motifs was the introduction of Japanese art to the European market. After a policy of isolationism for over 200 years, American military pressure forced Japan to open their ports to trade in 1858. This allowed Japanese art to reach a wider audience, which had a significant influence on European art of the late 19th century. Many Danish porcelain artists borrowed motifs and forms from Japanese works, especially woodblock prints. Samuel Bing, the Frenchman who popularized the term Art Nouveau, also created a magazine called Le Japon Artistique, which promoted Japanese aesthetics in Europe. The page on screen comes directly from that magazine, and you can see how the motif published in the magazine was used almost exactly on the small Royal Copenhagen vase. As an interesting side note, in Bing's work as an art dealer, part of the magazine's purpose was to increase demand and create a market for the Japanese pieces that he was bringing into Europe. In talking about Art Nouveau Danish porcelain, it's really interesting and important to discuss the market. The pieces that I've shown so far have mostly been unique works signed by the artist and therefore would have commanded a higher price. In response to the growing popularity of underglazed works, however, both companies introduced lines of porcelain intended for more budget-conscious consumers. Royal Copenhagen created a Courant Kunst, or market art division, in 1893. It began with 16 female artists, and it steadily expanded, peaking at about 70 artists. They produced figurines, boxes, vases, buttons, and other items using set designs on set objects that therefore could be easily replicated for faster production. These artists were identified with a number on the bottom of the object, and while we've been able to identify many artists, many more remain unfortunately unknown. Bang & Grundle wanted to keep up, and so they also hired modelers and painters to create a similar, albeit less varied, line of underglazed pieces for the wider market. International exhibitions were critical to broadening the global market for Danish porcelain. Both companies won top honors at the Paris World's Fairs in 1889 and 1900, and Royal Copenhagen received gold medals at the Chicago and St. Louis World's Fairs of 1893 and 1904, respectively. In the exhibition, we featured multiple pieces that were on display in Chicago, including these three. So I'm going to pause for a second and let you take a look at them. Now, can you find them in this picture of Royal Copenhagen's display at the Chicago World's Fair? I'll let everybody take a second to see if you can find them yourselves before I let you know where they are. Okay, so if you haven't found them already, they're pretty front and center. So there they are. These kinds of connections are obviously really exciting for us when we're able to spot pieces in contemporary photographs of exhibitions or sales rooms. Danish porcelain was not only receiving critical acclaim at exhibitions, but also attracting buyers of significant status, including the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, who purchased this polar bear, and also Louis Comfort Tiffany, who owned this mouse vase. Royal Copenhagen's international popularity was such that they opened retail shops in London, Paris, and New York. Both companies also had retail operations in Copenhagen itself. The peak of the Art Nouveau period of Danish porcelain was between 1890 and 1910. However, after World War I, Art Deco came into fashion and Art Nouveau declined in popularity. Many pieces went out of production, and both factories introduced new lines to keep up with changing tastes. In addition, other major international events like the Great Depression affected sales, and at Royal Copenhagen, we see that their motifs shifted to cater more towards a Danish audience rather than an international one. The last underglazed signature artist was Lars Swain, who worked at Royal Copenhagen from 1954 to 1959, but was largely unsuccessful in reviving underglazed popularity. Although most people today associate Bang & Grundle and Royal Copenhagen with their Christmas plates, this period from 1885 to about 1920 represents a unique stylistic and technical moment in Danish porcelain. It was a renaissance in porcelain in the country and marked a turning point for both companies, where manufacturers throughout Europe followed their lead and adopted the underglaze technique as well as some of the fancier glazes. This intersection of an interest in organic forms, Japanese art, and restraint over gaudiness, combined with relentless experimentation, makes Danish Art Nouveau porcelain a fascinating and unique area of study in the ceramics world. So as I mentioned before, this exhibit is currently on display at Iowa State University museums until May 9th. We also do have a virtual tour of it on our website, danishmuseum.org, that I invite everybody to take a look at if you're interested in seeing some more of the pieces and learning a bit more about Danish porcelain. I know we have some time for questions now, but if anybody has questions at a later time, I've included my contact information on the screen here, along with the museum's website. I believe questions can be sent in through the chat function. So thank you so much.
Well, it looks like this is Leo Landis. It looks like we have one question in the chat that says the Swedish and Norwegian immigrant communities in the upper Midwest have a very strong cultural influence to this day. What are some examples of Danish cultural influences that we can see today? And I know Tova Brandt is also on the chat, or on the event tonight. So if Tova wants to chime in, or not, Dia wants to.
Do you want to flip a coin for this one?
I can start and then you can pick up.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So some of it are in place names. We do still see some places that were heavily settled by Danish immigrants that have very, very Danish names. Dannebo, I think, is one of them. There's several others. And then Tova, I'll let you take it away.
Sure. Well, one of the settlement patterns in the upper Midwest for Scandinavian immigrants and Danes and Swedes and Norwegians is, a lot of them brought the agricultural backgrounds that they grew up with and were expert in, and kind of recreated that agricultural model here in the upper Midwest. And to the extent that they were landing in a place with a similar climate, if they were lucky enough for that, then they could pursue a lot of the similar crops and livestock that they were used to. One of the particular models of agricultural systems that Danish immigrants brought was the model of cooperative creameries. They actually developed the cooperative creamery model in Denmark as a way that many small dairy farmers could work together to maximize both the processing and marketing of their products. They brought that model to the United States and sometimes were even recruited to come to areas of the United States and kind of introduce and set up that cooperative creamery model. So that's one kind of very direct influence. You can see influences in some political social values that some historians have traced, and just a lot of the food traditions that continue on. It's not an accident that meatballs and potatoes are really associated with Midwestern food. Those have long backgrounds in Scandinavian culture as well. And Legos. Let's not forget Legos. Legos are Danish. They still are Danish. And so, we honor that at our museum as well.
We got another question that was, many of the porcelain pieces you shared featured animals or insects with a lot of personality. Was this a trait specific to Danish work, characteristic of Art Nouveau, or was it more common? So in general, the Art Nouveau period found inspiration in the natural world. I think for both companies, they found that their figurines of animals were very popular. And so that was something, of course, that they produced more of. But in general, the Art Nouveau period around Europe was characterized by an interest in natural forms. We see a lot of floral motifs elsewhere around Europe, such as in like French Art Nouveau pieces and British. The bat and bugs are definitely stand out as being more unique. But but the broader concept of inspiration from the natural world is indicative of Art Nouveau, but definitely some of the pieces are more unique to the Danish production. Would each of you share what your favorite item in the museum collection is, why, and what the story is behind it? Ooh. Tova, do you have an immediate answer? Because I may have to think of this for a second.
I mean, favorite objects generally change day by day for me. One of the stories that I think is really compelling is actually a piece that a lot of visitors don't expect to see in our museum, and it's a motorcycle. It's a motorcycle from 1960. A Danish manufacturing company made Nimbus motorcycles, and they were very stylish and sleek. And for a while, all of the Danish postal delivery people delivered mail by motorcycle. so Nimbus motorcycle were often mail carrier vehicles. This particular motorcycle was brought to the United States by a Danish immigrant in Chicago and used with other Danish immigrants in the Chicago area for the Nimbus Club. And they all had their Nimbus motorcycles, and they would go out on rides together in the highways and byways in the greater Chicago area. This is where the story gets a little sad. On one of these rides, this Danish immigrant was riding with his young son behind him on the motorcycle. A pickup truck failed to stop at a stop sign, struck them, and the bike was badly damaged, and the young son was killed. The family, of course, was deeply grieving that loss and didn't know what to do with the wrecked motorcycle, and so just put it in a shed and didn't think about it. Many years later, as this family became more connected with the museum, the idea developed to repair the bicycle, repair it back to how it should be running and looking as though it were just off the factory line in 1960. And they sent it back to Denmark to a specialist in Nimbus repair. He did that. He put it entirely back to working order, shipped it again to the United States. It was brought to the museum for Tivoli Fest in 1910, along with other members of the Chicago Nimbus Club. They rode their Nimbus motorcycles in the Tivoli Fest parade, and then continued on to the museum, where it was donated to the museum. So it stands on exhibit now as both a beautiful example of Danish design, of industrial technology, but also this really touching, personal story of family and loss and legacy. And so there's just so many layers to that one piece. So that's a favorite.
Yeah, I think for me, one of my favorites is the blonde comet that I shared, just because there's also an interesting part of that where I believe it was built while his wife was out of town, and his quote was something like, "Well, my wife was gone, so I had nothing to keep me company. So I was so bored that I built a car." But there's also another piece. It's a pillow made entirely out of ribbons. And the father of the family was, I believe, a dairy farmer, and he won ribbons at a variety of fairs and events. And so for him, I believe his daughter basically created a pillow of all those ribbons. And it's a beautiful piece in our textile collection that unfortunately is not on display, but it is searchable. And you can see the thoughtfulness of it. And I think it's an interesting connection to the Danish dairy industry, but it's also just a beautiful story of a family.
Very Very cool. Well, it looks like we've got about 5 minutes left. If anybody else wants to submit a question in the chat, please go ahead and do that. While we're waiting for any of those to come in, I'll ask one last question. A lot of cities in the United States have areas like a Little Italy or a Chinatown. Is there anywhere that has a little Denmark or a little Copenhagen?
Not that I'm aware of. Tova, would you?
The places that really have a Danish character are usually small towns that have had a critical mass of Danish settlement, and so some of them might be called Little Denmark. One of them that comes to mind is Solvang, California, which is kind of in the middle of wine country. So it's this little, it's a community that just is like kind of the Disneyland version of Denmark in the middle of California wine country. But it's a really fun place to visit. And it's got a true, authentic Danish story there of Danish Americans who frankly just were sick of the weather of the upper Midwest. And so they went to California. So there's a handful of smaller communities through the Midwest: Tyler, Minnesota, Askell, Minnesota, Ringsted, Iowa, and then Elkhorn and Kimballton. But there are very few places. I can't think of any urban places that have a neighborhood within a larger metro area. There just were almost never enough Danes to have that critical mass to kind of claim a geographic spot to themselves.
I have a question. Yeah, I've unmuted. What about Dannebrog, Nebraska?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Just-
Dannebrog is another perfect example. Nysted, Nebraska was another place, but Dannebrog is officially the Danish capital of Nebraska by state decree.
Is it named after the flag?
Yes, it is.
Nice. Looks
It's
like
a-
we had, oh,
It's a
go ahead,
cool
Margie.
town- Cool town to visit if you ever get a chance. Very
Yeah.
small.
We had, let's make this our last question for the night. We had one in the chat. Your visual display is quite interesting. What % of your collection fits in the visual display?
I'm going to try and do some mental math very quickly. So we have about 8,000 of our approximately 20,000 objects there. So that would be about 40%. That's kind of a rough estimate, but yeah, around 40%. So it's definitely a pretty significant portion of our collection that we're able to have viewable.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dia and Tova, for jumping in on some of the questions. Thank you for being with us tonight to share that virtual tour of the Museum of Danish America, one of the state's great historical museums and cultural museums. So thank you very much for being with us. As you can see from some of the comments in the chat, people are identifying with it on a heritage level and on an interest level and all kinds of things. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being part of History Camp Iowa. For anybody who's registered for the other virtual museum tours we have this week, you'll receive an email each morning with a link to that evening's session. And for those of you who are registered for Saturday's event, there will be an email that goes out tomorrow, Thursday evening, with information on schedule and Zoom links and things like that. So thank you so much for being part of this event, and we'll go ahead and close it out for the night.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Dia.